Well, it is a joy to be up here this morning, but I have to confess it's a surprise. Please pray for Pastor Larry. He'll be back soon. I have a slight advantage. Some of you may be thinking, well, Pastor, with such short notice to be up here and be ready to preach, how do you do it? Well, my advantage is I just preached the message Sunday in Spanish. So now I get to preach it in English. Now, there's no guarantees. There might not be a Spanish word slip out, but I'll try my best. A friend was joking with me and says, well, how can you be ready for this? It's because the message never changes. Why are we here tonight? To be blessed in the song by kids that sing. To hear a testimony, to hear a prayer request, to shake someone's hand, get a hug. Well, maybe not during COVID, but that's why we're here. To fellowship not only with each other, but also to fellowship around the message of God's Word. And yes, this chapter has been quoted as Pastor Carl described it. Chapter that we could very easily take each verse, look at it, memorize it upon our hearts. But what we're going to do is we're going to walk through that chapter, all 12 verses, and we're actually going to see God's gospel displayed through it. So if you would, take your Bibles and let's turn to Isaiah chapter 53, and we'll start with verse number 1. The suffering servant. This is a picture of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, our Savior. He's been pictured throughout Isaiah as the servant of the Lord. Israel itself had been described as the servant of the Lord, and its mission was to carry the message of the Lord throughout Israel and then also throughout all the nations. Sadly, though, Israel, just like us, we are sinful beings, we have failed, and we are stained by sin. But God introduced in chapter 42 his servant in whom he was well pleased. If you take time to read verses 1 through 6, that's the introduction of Jesus Christ. And as we come here now to Isaiah chapter 53, we're going to see his whole life spread out in just the one chapter. His birth was hinted at in chapter 7. A virgin will conceive and bear a child, God with us. It was also hinted in chapter 9, where it says, a son is born, and upon his shoulders he'll be called Mighty God, Prince of Peace. All throughout Isaiah, there has been a hint of the Messiah coming. Well, once he was born, we find out here in chapter 53, we're going to see probably the worst part of his life unfold for us. Because in verse number 1 of Isaiah chapter 53, the first thing we're going to see is the unbelief of a nation. Verse number 1 says, who has believed our message? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he who grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of parched ground. He has no stately form or majesty that we should look upon him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him. Verse number 1, as you look at it by itself, it asks just really the simple question, who has believed our message? Well, to understand that question, you have to understand a little bit before it. In the beginning chapters of Isaiah, he was already proclaiming that judgment was going to come against Israel, the 10 northern tribes. Judgment was going to come against them first by Assyria. It finally took place in chapters 37 and 38 when Hezekiah ended up seeing what took place. But Hezekiah, you remember, was the king of Judah. And though Isaiah was prophesying from Jerusalem about the fall of Israel, he ended up saying to Judah and Jerusalem, Don't think that you're going to get off scot-free. The judgment, the penalty, the pain that Israel is going to suffer, and then as they're exiled to foreign nations, you're going to feel it as well. And it was the transgressions of the people. It was the idolatry that as a nation they had accepted and that they had just dove into. That was what they were doing, and finally God said, I've got to judge. So Israel was getting ready to go away. Of course, there were those that were touting, no, this message from this prophet is false. You don't have to worry about it. But who has believed our message? Isaiah was proclaiming the judgment that was to come, but also he was proclaiming the Messiah and the blessings of the future kingdom. You see, these are kind of like interspersed throughout the chapters. Sometimes we read the prophets, you think doom and gloom. Sometimes that's what it seems like. Sometimes you read one prophet, that's all it appears to be. But yet in Isaiah, both are present, and they kind of like alternate one to the other. But the problem is the nation was not believing the message. They weren't believing the message of judgment that was going to come, nor were they believing the message of the Messiah. Oh, it'll happen one day. It's way out there. But it really doesn't affect my life right now. And though the Messiah had been promised, people were living for them. They were not living for his coming, nor were they working for his glory and his kingdom. You know, sometimes I feel we're the same way. Over 2,000 years, scoffers even said, where is the promise of his coming? Do we believe the promise? The message hasn't changed. Just like our Lord, he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. But this was Isaiah's question as he begins this whole chapter. Who has believed this message? He goes on to say as well, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Well, it was revealed in a powerful, judgmental way to Israel. They were defeated, they were conquered, and they were carried off. Caused a time of great lamentation. And Judah themselves, as they saw their sister, Israel, being carried off into captivity, and they themselves with the enemy at the gate, threatening to come in and conquer them. They were under siege as well. They were under the threat. They felt the fear. And the arm of the Lord was revealed. It was revealed in judgment to Israel, and yet the Lord also revealed his hand to Judah at the same time, promising the Messiah that he was going to come. So what we see in verse number 1 is the unbelief of a nation. Verse number 2, for he grew up before him like a tender shoot. For he, Messiah, grew up before him, God the Father, like a tender shoot, like a root out of parched ground. He, the Messiah, has no stately form or majesty that we should look at him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him. The second thing I see here about the Lord is his righteousness, his sinlessness, and his humility. No kingly form, no majestic authority, no family name or lineage that made him stand out above the rest. He's a common man, born to a common family. But yet we also see some important notes about him. Hold your place right here. Now let's go to Isaiah chapter 11. The word that was used, he grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root out of parched ground. That appeared earlier in Isaiah in chapter 11. Isaiah here is giving a hint of future glory. And look what he says in chapter 11, verse number 1. Then a shoot will spring up from the stem of Jesse, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the shoot, the stem, the branch. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom, the Spirit of understanding, the Spirit of counsel, the Spirit of strength, the Spirit of knowledge, and of the fear of the Lord. Notice how many words are there? Spirit of wisdom, 1. Understanding, counsel, strength, knowledge, fear, and then also in verse number 2, the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him. The 7 spirits of the Lord mentioned in Revelation is even mentioned right here in Isaiah chapter 11. But when it talks about wisdom, counsel, judging without, look at verse number 3, continuing on, And he, the root, the shoot, the stem, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord, and he will not judge by what his eyes see, nor make a decision by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he will judge the poor, and decide with fairness the afflicted of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Also the righteousness will be the belt about his loins, and faithfulness the belt about his waist. If that's a description of the shoot, the branch, that's referred to in Isaiah chapter 53, for he grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root out of parched ground. No stately form or majesty that we would look upon him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him. But what did he teach? What did he say? He would give righteous decisions to the poor. You know, it seems today decisions that are being held up within the Supreme Courts, it's like, where are they coming up with these decisions? It's among the rich and the mighty. Wars upon the financial strongholds. They're the ones that contain the courts. They're the ones that are giving out these crazy decisions. But Christ is going to be the one that will give righteous decisions, not to the rich and the powerful, but to the poor. You see, that's my Savior. And if his humility, his sincerity, his righteousness is going to be not to the rich, but even also to the poor, there's a righteousness that's in this judge that has been in no other judge that's ever existed. Under his rule is where I want to be. So in verse number 2 of Isaiah 53, I see the righteousness of this servant that has been introduced by Isaiah. I see also his sinlessness, his faithfulness, and I also see his humility. Not his charisma, not his intelligence, not his oratory. I see a servant. Am I like that? Am I a servant? Verse number 3 starts to get graphic. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And like one from whom men hide their face, he was despised, and we did not esteem him. You see, I see here the beginning of the persecution and the torture that took place. Despised, forsaken, rejected, and one from whom men hide their face. I can't see it. The pain, the suffering, it's too much to bear. I got to turn away. And he did it for us. Oh, I got to share this good news. It'll come out in prayer as well. But we've been praying sincerely for Diana Baldwin. She's on the ventilator, one of our dear old ladies. Comes early every week, sits right over there, has her little walker. just comes in slowly, carefully, sits down. She's been on a ventilator. This week and last week, the doctors tried to take her off 3 times, and it did not look good. Each time the body was rejecting life, coming back, and it was depending upon the ventilator more than what it was kicking back into gear. The family, or the hospital, told the family to call family in. Toby Scott went and picked up her family yesterday morning from the airport. The hospital had 1:30 as the date set when they were all going to come in and 2 by 2 go into the intensive care, say goodbye, and then afterwards pull the plug. I thought it strange. I didn't hear anything from Toby. Till finally I heard over a prayer chain, they pulled the plug and everything started working. She was sitting up. She was talking. Tomorrow she's going home. We serve a servant who hears our lowly, weak prayers. If that doesn't touch you in your heart and wake you up, you're dead. That's the Lord that we serve. And when I think about the grace that He shows at times, it makes me think how grateful I am. I just had COVID not too long ago, survived. My father-in-law survived. My mother-in-law is in heaven. We have no guarantee of tomorrow. And as we go into our prayer closets and we start to pray and we remember all those other people that have serious needs and petitions before them, have you ever been praying for them and realized, God, thank you so much for what you've given me? Have you ever been there? But to realize he was rejected and the torture began, so much so that we have to hide the face. How quickly we forget what he suffered and what we enjoy. But see, this message, it never gets old, does it? Because he now wants us to turn around and continue to serve. I see in verse number 4, the actual crucifixion. Surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried. Yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. Smitten of God. When it was me that was smiting him with my own sins that he was bearing for me. What does it mean when it talks about smitten by God? It's because the justice that God requires in his moral law can only be satisfied by a pure, sinless sacrifice. And he did that for me. He was smitten of God. Now we'll see other phrases that will end up applying to that. It's because God's justice required it. The wages of sin is death. The soul that sins, it must die. That's what we all deserve. That was the punishment that we should have taken. But God, rather than smiting us, chose to smite the substitute. He was smitten by God for me. It was my sins that put him there. It was my sins that he was carrying. The crucifixion is in view in verse number 4. Verse number 5. What I see here clearly is his substitution. Verse 5 says, but he was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. And the chastening of our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. There was an intentional substitution that took place. An agreement, yes, that was forged ever before the foundations of the world, but it came to view and realization on that particular day. If he's going to be our substitute, stand in our place, suffer and pay for the payment of our sin, he had to fulfill everything so that he would be accepted by God. He had to be sinless, and that was his condition. He stood in my place, pierced through, crushed, and the chastening for our well-being fell upon him. What did God have in view through this whole time of the Passion Week? Our well-being. I know none of you are perfect, and I know there had to have been a day in your lives when your parents said something to the effect of, "This is going to hurt me more than it does you." Have you ever heard anything like that? It happened to me too. Quite often. We won't go into too many details. But when you look at well-being, how is it then pain, difficulty, chastening? How is it that well-being is actually the outcome? And all too often, humanity wants to raise their fist and blame God for everything, but in this picture and in this chapter, God is doing all of this pre-planned, predetermined, predestined. He's doing it all for our well-being. Are we grateful for that? Do we have that in mind? He was our substitute. Verse number 6 says, "All of us like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, but the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him." That right there is the motivation for the gospel. John 3:16, what does it say? For God so loved who? The world. Us. That's the motivation behind it. The Lord has caused the iniquity to fall upon him. Why? Because he saw us like lost sheep. We were led astray by our own sin, and rather than willingly obey and repent and return, we were lost. God's motivation in love was to make all of this happen. The plan of redemption was known ever before creation began. Everything came to unfold in its perfect time and in the fullness of time. And the suffering servant came on the scene when it was necessary. As the Old Testament saints looked forward to this moment, we are here in present day looking back to that event that took place. God caused our iniquity of all mankind, ages past, ages future. God caused that all iniquity fall upon him. For our well-being, the verse said previously. And how ungrateful we are at times. How selfish we become when our vision looks just to us and our needs, my concerns, fulfilling my agendas. Boy, we as Christians sometimes can be pitifully selfish, can't we? Shake your heads, nod your heads with me. I'm not the only one up here nodding my head. That's us, all of us together. But I'm thankful that God's motivation was to save me, to make it all happen for my well-being. In verse number 7, I clearly see Christ's voluntary sacrifice. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth. There was an intentional, voluntary sacrifice that Christ was giving to us. When he took our place, it was not by plan of man. It was by plan of God. He intentionally laid his life down. It was not taken. You know, Jesus says in John 10, "For this reason the Father loves me, because I laid down my life so that I may take it again. No one has taken it away from me." No one surprised me, murdered me. I'm not a victim of a random event. This was pre-planned. This needed to be done. God wanted to redeem a world, and he needed a sinless sacrifice. There was clear motivation that was here, and it was a voluntary sacrifice. No one twisted his arm. No one forced him to that cross. He willingly did it for me. And how unworthy we are. But he loved me, and he loves you. That message doesn't get old. We see here that it's a voluntary sacrifice. And he goes on to say, "No one has taken it from me, but I lay it down of my own initiative. I have authority." That means I. That means watch. Notice. Forget it. No one has taken it away from me, but I lay it down of my own initiative. I have authority to lay it down. And I have authority to take it up again. This commandment I received from my Father. Nothing was done by surprise. This was all planned. Why? God wanted to redeem me. I was lost in sin. My transgression broke my union with God, but God brings everything back together because he loves me and he loves you. The message doesn't change. It's so real. It's what we need. Not just for life and material. No, it's what my soul, my heart needs. And that's what builds me up. Goes on to say, verse number 8, his actual death is in picture in verse number 8. By oppression and judgment, he was taken away. And as for his generation, notice the little comma there. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off from the land of the living for the transgression of my people, to whom the stroke was due? How many people were actually realizing, as the prophet mentions it, that when Christ was upon the cross, how many people were actually realizing that he was God's sacrifice to redeem all of mankind? Remember the Jews that were there mocking Jesus? Remember those that walked by spitting, blaspheming the Lord? Those people there, did they even consider God and what he was doing in that particular moment when he was cut off for them? You know, we have a whole society, nations of people that haven't considered it. Sometimes they haven't heard. That's why we have to be all the more diligent to make sure that they hear. You see, that stroke of judgment was meant for me. I was the one who deserved it. It was my sin that needed to be paid for. I was the one that had a debt before God. I was the one that was guilty. But have we considered that he voluntarily stepped into place so that he could receive my stroke and my judgment? Have we considered that? This was the actual death that was in picture right here. He was taken away. He did not faint. He was not just unconscious. He died. Physical death. Shedding of the blood. He died for me. He took my strokes, my chastisement. And in verse number 9, we see his burial. His grave was assigned with wicked men. Yet he was with a rich man in his death. Assigned with wicked men on either side, those that deserve the penalty. Christ in the middle, the innocent one dying in our place. Wicked men all around him, and yet in his death buried in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. Because he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. He didn't deserve it. He was innocent, but yet he willingly took my judgment upon him. We've seen the unbelief of a nation. We've seen his righteousness, his torture, his crucifixion, his intentional substitution, the motivation that caused it all, his voluntary sacrifice, his death, now his burial. And in verse number 10, we see his resurrection. But the Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief, if he would render himself as a guilt offering. He will see his offspring. He will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. How can that happen if he's dead? It can happen. Because of what he did, because of the justice the Messiah provided, being our substitute upon the cross, the Lord saw it, and it was sufficient for that debt that we all owed. The resurrection is in view here. God is going to prolong his days, bless the fruit, his fruit. And then it said in the last part of that, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. That cannot happen to a dead person. Have you enjoyed the blessings of the Lord in your sinful state? We all have. Sitting with a gentleman in my office yesterday that came in, and we start sharing about how God's been so good to us. He blesses us in spite of what we do at times. Are we grateful for that? Do we consider all that the Lord did? You know, because when I start to think about it, in light of all that other people are suffering, and in light of what he is suffering as well, it brings joy to my life. Helps me see how grateful I should be. Sometimes I'm not there. Sometimes I'm more self-sided. I'm seeing what I need or what I lack. Why is this happening to me, not other people? And our vision starts to close in. Before too long, we're becoming bitter. We're becoming angry. But that very vision that is closing in, God's trying to get us to open it up, to see what other people are going through, to see what their needs are. And when I see my sin debt, I'm as guilty as the worst of all sinners. As Paul ended up saying, I am the chief of sinners. None of us deserve God's grace. But he loves me. He did everything for my well-being. Christ went through every passage, every difficulty and event that we talked about here in these verses. But yet his resurrection is in view. God will prolong his days, will bless his fruit. Christ even said that I want to see you produce fruit, and I want to see your fruit remain. Is that our mission? Is that our desire? Are we trying to come up with fruit for the Lord? Harvest of souls? People that need to be saved? This encourages me. Because I'm not there all the time. And I'm a pastor. I see my failures. I see my weaknesses. And just like everyone else, my vision can start to close in, and bitterness can set in, and apathy begins to project itself. But when I see what he did for me, how can I be so selfish? How can I put on the back burner what's before his very eyes? Because of Christ's resurrection and the life that he lives, I have life. He died in my place so that I could live. And this life, which I now live, I live in his power and in his faith. That's what Paul quoted to us. That's what he said. That's where I want to get to where it's Christ living in me and then being seen through me. Putting selfishness out of the way, putting guilt out of the way, putting fear out of the way and doubt out of the way, allowing Christ to work through me. It's all because of the resurrection. He lives, my Savior lives, so I can live. And my life is not just an abundant and a fruitful life that he promises now, but it's an eternal, secure life forever. You know, life is short. Just Sunday, I used the illustration of time. You know, let's say this is 100 years. Where's 50? Let's say this is 1,000 years. Where's 50? Let's say this is 10,000 years. Where's 50? Let's say this is eternity. Where's 50? We lose track of God's timetable. A day is with the Lord as 1,000 years. 1,000 years is a day. And all that he paid for in 1 moment of time has guaranteed for me eternity because of his love for me. Why would anyone reject that? Sometimes they just don't hear it. Why don't they hear it? Well, we're not telling them. This gives me every motive to tell, every motive to share, because I see Christ's resurrection. Verse number 11. As a result of the anguish of his soul, the Messiah's soul on the cross, as a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. Who is he? God the Father will see the anguish of the soul. God the Father will see the sinlessness of that sacrifice. God the Father will see that there was no forcing. It was all voluntary. It was sincere and a humble love that sought my well-being because of what he did on Calvary. God will see it, and justice will be satisfied. By his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant will justify the many, as he will bear their iniquities. I see two things in this verse. I see God's justice being satisfied and my justification being freely given. What does it cost us? Financially, it costs us nothing. But because of what Christ suffered, the justice that God's holiness demands was satisfied. It was God dying for us, and an infinite God dying for our sins in a moment of time paid an infinite amount of sins. And because of that, we now are justified. It was his righteousness that covered my sin. And I am now justified. We've heard justified means just as if I never sinned. But as Pastor has explained, it means more than that. It's just as if we had never sinned to begin with. Justified as sinless in position as what Christ was. And then verse number 12. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he will divide the booty with the strong, because he poured out himself to death, and he was numbered with the transgressors. You see those first two phrases in verse number 12, you have the picture of the conqueror and the spoils. Well, what was conquered in that particular moment of the crucifixion and Christ's death? What was conquered? Sin was conquered. You know, the document of death that our sin had written against us. We were guilty because of this sin and this sin and this sin. You see, that document, according to Colossians, was destroyed. He took our penalty, paid our price, and because of that, sin was done away with. Sin has no more power over us. We are now justified and positionally before the Lord free. Just as if I had never sinned or ever had even sinned from before. Can you wrap your head around that? And then the Lord talking about the victory, dividing the booty, sin being conquered. What's the booty? The spoils. We're the spoils. Who had us enslaved? Sin, Satan. He was the master, the prince of the power of the air. We're under his influence. We're his children. Christ even said to the religious people of his day, you are of your father, the devil. Now, when I'm justified, Christ is now resurrected. Verse number 12, I see his glorification. He is finally put into his place. He finally is recognized for what he has done. The spoils of the war are now being divided. And where we were enslaved by sin, we're now free. We represent those spoils. We represent the booty that is now divided after the war. We are now in the possession not of sin and slaves to it. We are now in the possession and treasured by the King and the conqueror. Amen? Verse number 12 shows us his glorification. And in verse number 12 as well, it says, because he poured out himself to death, and he was numbered with the transgressors, yet he himself bore the sin of many and interceded for the transgressors. You know, we've seen the unbelief, his righteousness, his torture, his crucifixion, substitution, motivation, voluntary sacrifice, his death, his burial, his resurrection, our justification, and then his glorification. All in one chapter of the Bible. Do you realize what you have in the Christ? Are you thankful for it? Do you know beyond a shadow of a doubt you are redeemed? Have you placed your faith in his sacrifice? You know, the whole story of Christ's life is right there. Now, granted, there's other verses that can do the job that I did tonight in just one verse. You quote John 3:16, you've got it pretty much all there as well, too. But throughout that chapter, I saw my lost state, but I saw God arranging everything for my well-being. Who looks after you and your well-being? Few people sometimes. Few people. But for God himself to look for the well-being of all humankind. There will be no man that will stand before the Lord one day and said, you didn't let me know. You didn't tell me. You were not there for me. No one will be able to say that. After all that God has done from the very beginning, all that he's doing today, even through the difficulties that are coming into our life, and we see how he's using them and building us up through them, and he's doing good for us, and then we see what he's yet to do in the future. Broaden the vision. Don't be so self-centered. When I see what he did, I see my weaknesses, I see my failures. But I see his example. And it gives me encouragement. Because one day in his glorified state, he will not be ashamed to stand with me. As he has judged righteously, he will be faithful. There is now no condemnation to those who are in Christ. He loves me with an eternal love. I just have to accept it. I have to make an intelligent decision to understand all of what he did for me. And then I see my need of what he did for me, and then I ask him to save me. You see, when I recognize my need and I see all that he did for me as a sinless, voluntary, substitutionary sacrifice, when I see what he did for me, all I have to do is come to him and confess him as Lord. Trust him to be my Savior. He's the one that can forgive my sin. He's the one that can secure my soul for all eternity. Just like Adam and Eve, in Adam and Eve, we all lost it in the garden. The only one that can take that sinful nature and justify it is Jesus Christ. Have you placed your faith in him today? Are you trusting him to be your sacrifice for sin? Or are you trying to do it yourself? You're wasting your time if you're trying to do it yourself. Because guaranteed you may do good for a while, but eventually there's going to be sin. And then the problem still exists. What are you going to do for all the bad sins you did before? There's only one person who can wipe that all away. It's Jesus, and he wants to do that for you. So that one day in the future, he can stand by our side and we can be in eternal communion with him. Lord, we thank you so much for your word today. And Lord, the message does not get old. Thank you for what you wrote through Isaiah over 700 years before Christ's birth. And here we are 2,000 years later. Lord, the message doesn't get old, but it's a message we need to share. And it's a message that we need to allow to build up in us. Because we do suffer illness, suffer problems, suffer persecution, suffer death. And we look inside as self-centered people, and we forget the vision that you have to use us in our pain for your glory. As Christ was our suffering servant, in our suffering, Lord, help us to serve others.